The worst part about being humiliated by a man who ruins lives for a living was that Nora couldn't exactly call HR. Dominic broke her heart with 6 casual words. "You're too big for this life." He thought she'd quietly accept it. He was wrong. And now, he was the one begging. The basement of the Moretti estate always smelled of turpentine, old dust, and damp stone. It was her sanctuary. For 3 years, Nora sat under harsh fluorescent lights, painstakingly restoring stolen Renaissance oils and forged modern abstracts before they were filtered through the family's legitimate galleries. She was Nora. Just Nora. She was the girl with the soft, heavy arms, the broad hips that bumped into the drafting tables, and the steady hands that made Dominic Moretti millions in clean cash. Dominic was the heir. He was cold, meticulous, and cut from sharp angles. He wore $5,000 suits like armor. And for the last year, he had been coming down to her basement. It started with him just checking on inventory. Then he started bringing her coffee. Black, 2 sugars, exactly how she took it. He'd sit on a stool in the corner, loosening his silk tie, and just breathe. Away from his father's yelling, away from the blood and the syndicates. They talked about art, then about life, and eventually about nothing at all, just sitting in comfortable, heavy silence. Nora was not an idiot. She knew what she looked like. She'd been fat her whole life. She knew the geometry of her own body, the way her stomach rolled when she sat, the thickness of her thighs chafing under a skirt. She knew the world was not built for her. But down in the basement, Dominic looked at her like she was a masterpiece, or so she stupidly thought. The mistake happened on the night of the Moretti Winter Gala. Usually, Nora stayed home during these things, but Dominic had insisted. "You restored the Caravaggio replica we're auctioning. You should be there, Nora. Wear something nice." So, she did. She bought a deep emerald velvet gown. It was heavy and expensive, tailored to grip her waist and drape over her hips. She spent 2 hours on her hair. When she looked in the mirror, for the first time in years, she didn't see the fat girl. She saw a woman. The ballroom was suffocating. She hid on the second-floor balcony, gripping a glass of champagne, watching the snow fall over the manicured gardens. The heavy glass door clicked open, shutting out the noise of the string quartet. Dominic stepped out. He looked exhausted. He leaned against the stone balustrade next to her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, cedar and something metallic. "You're hiding," he said, his voice a low gravel. "I don't belong in there," Nora replied, staring out at the snow. "You belong wherever you want to be." He turned his head to look at her. His dark eyes dragged over her face, down to the neckline of the velvet dress, and back up. The air between them felt thick, heavy. It was the same tension that lived in the basement, but amplified by the dark night and the champagne humming in her veins. She made the choice. She stepped closer. The tip of her shoe touched his. She reached out, her fingers gently brushing the lapel of his tuxedo jacket. "Dominic," she whispered. For a fraction of a second, he leaned in. His eyes fluttered shut. Then he froze. His entire body went rigid. He didn't just step back. He recoiled. Her hand fell to her side, suddenly feeling like a block of lead. The cold winter air rushed into the space between them. "Nora, stop." His voice wasn't gentle anymore. It was the voice he used when giving orders to his soldiers. Flat. Dead. "I'm sorry," she stammered, the heat rushing to her cheeks. You thought wrong." He rubbed his jaw, looking away from her, out toward the dark trees. He looked annoyed, trapped. You're a genius with a canvas. You're good company. But this? Us? It's not happening. The bluntness of it felt like a physical strike. You don't have to be cruel about it. I'm being pragmatic. Dominic finally looked back at her. His eyes were devoid of the warmth she thought she'd seen 100 times before. Look at me, Nora. Now look at you. She swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight, filled with broken glass. What does that mean? He sighed, a harsh, impatient sound. I run this family now. Everything I do is scrutinized. The woman standing next to me in photographs, at galas, at syndicate meetings, she is a reflection of my power. She needs to look a certain way. Fit a certain mold. You don't fit the picture. The words sank into her skin. It wasn't that he didn't feel anything. It was that he cared more about how it looked. I'm fat, she said. The word tasted like copper in her mouth, but she forced it out. She wasn't going to let him hide behind polite corporate speak. Just say it, Dominic. He didn't flinch. You're too big to be mine, Nora. The men I deal with are vicious. They look for any weakness, any flaw to mock. I won't have my personal life become a punchline. You are a liability in my world. Silence fell over the balcony. The snow kept dropping, quiet and indifferent. Nora didn't cry. Crying was for women who didn't expect to be hurt. She had spent a lifetime building armor out of sarcasm and low expectations. The armor held. She looked down at her emerald dress. It just felt like heavy fabric now. Right, she said, her voice eerily steady. She set her half-full champagne glass on the stone ledge. My mistake. She didn't wait for him to say anything else. She turned around, the velvet sweeping the freezing stone floor, and walked back into the heat and noise of the ballroom. She walked out the front doors, hailed a cab in the snow, and went home. Nora didn't go back to the basement. The next morning, before the sun was even up, she called Leo, Dominic's underboss. She told him she was done. She emailed an invoice for her final week, packed her specialized brushes, and left the keys to the studio on the kitchen counter of her apartment. A week later, she was hired at the Metropolitan Archives. The pay was a third of what the Mafia paid her, but the air smelled like old paper instead of blood money. Her new boss was an 80-year-old man named Arthur, who only cared about her ability to repair 16th-century binding. Nobody cared about the size of her waist. For the first month, she waited for the knock on her door. She knew how the Morettis operated. You didn't just quit, but the knock never came. Dominic let her go. He probably thought he was doing her a favor, sparing her further humiliation. Or worse, he just didn't care enough to stop her. Dominic's reality, however, was fracturing. For the first 2 weeks, Dominic barely noticed Nora's absence. He was busy securing a shipping port on the East Coast. He hired a new restorer, a thin, nervous man from Prague who worked fast and asked no questions. But then, the quiet moments started to hit him. He walked down to the basement on a Tuesday night, a file of shipment manifests in his hand, his head pounding from a 3-hour screaming match with the Russian bosses. He pushed open the heavy oak door, expecting the sharp scent of turpentine and the soft hum of the radio. Nora always kept tuned to an obscure jazz station. Instead, the room smelled like bleach and cheap takeout. The radio was silent. The Prague guy was hunched over a canvas, his hands shaking slightly as Dominic entered. Dominic stared at the empty stool in the corner, the stool where he used to sit and just breathe. Leave, Dominic snapped at the man. The restorer scrambled out of the room. Dominic stood alone under the harsh fluorescent lights. He felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest, right behind his ribs. It was an entirely foreign sensation. He pushed it down. He was Dominic Moretti, He didn't have time for regret. He started dating Clara. Clara was exactly what he had described to Nora on the balcony. She was a former model, tall, razor-thin, with cheekbones that looked sharp enough to cut glass. She was flawless. When they walked into a restaurant, every man in the room looked at him with envy. It was exactly what he wanted, until he had to actually speak to her. They were sitting in a VIP booth at a high-end club. The bass was vibrating the table. Clara was picking at a salad, talking about a Fashion Week party she wanted to attend. Dominic looked at her, really looked at her. Her perfection was sterile. There was no warmth in her eyes, no quick, cynical wit waiting to catch him off guard. She agreed with everything he said. She flinched when he raised his voice. She was an accessory, a very expensive, breathing watch. He thought of Nora. He thought of the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed at a dark joke. He remembered the soft, warm weight of her arm brushing against his when she showed him a detail on a canvas. He remembered how grounded he felt just being in the same room as her. He had called her a liability. He had looked at the one real, solid thing in his violent, artificial life, and he had thrown it away because he was afraid of what a bunch of aging, irrelevant mobsters would think. The realization hit him so hard, he physically swayed in his seat. He was a coward. The ruthless head of the Moretti family was a pathetic, image-obsessed coward. "Dominic?" Clara asked, her perfectly manicured hand touching his sleeve. "Are you listening?" "No," he said quietly. He stood up, dropping a $100 bill on the table for a drink he hadn't touched. "I have to go." It took him 3 days to track her down. Nora was sitting in the back room of the archives, carefully applying a solvent to a water-damaged ledger, when the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. She didn't have to look up to know who it was. The heavy, measured footsteps on the linoleum were unmistakable. "You're hard to find," Dominic said. She kept her eyes on her work. She dipped a cotton swab into the solvent. That was the point. He walked closer, stopping on the other side of her work table. He looked different. The sharp, immaculate edge he usually carried was frayed. There were dark circles under his eyes. His tie was slightly crooked. "The new guy ruined a Modigliani fake," Dominic said, trying for a casual tone. "I need you back at the estate." She finally looked up. He was standing there, expecting her to jump, expecting her to be grateful that the king had descended from his tower to ask for a favor. No. Nora tossed the used swab into the trash bin and picked up a clean one. Dominic blinked. "No? Nora, I'll double your old rate. Triple it. Whatever this public service job is paying you, it's an insult to your talent." "The pay is fine," she said, her voice deadpan. "And I don't have to worry about my boss ordering a hit on someone before lunch. It's very peaceful." He put his hands on the table, leaning forward. The scent of cedar hit her, making her stomach twist. But she forced her face to remain entirely blank. "Nora, come back." It was half command, half plea. "I don't fit the picture, Dominic. Remember?" She looked him dead in the eye, refusing to shrink. "Your wife needs to look a certain way. Your employees probably need to look a certain way, too. You wouldn't want a liability hanging around the basement. What if the Russians see me?" He flinched, the actual physical flinch of a man who just took a bullet. "I was an idiot," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I was out of my mind with stress, and I said things I didn't mean. You meant every word." She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, but her voice was ice. "You weren't stressed, Dominic. You were honest. You looked at my body, and you decided I wasn't good enough to stand next to you. You made your choice. Nora! Get out of my archive, Mr. Moretti, before I call security. I'm sure it wouldn't look good for your image to be escorted out of a public library. She turned her back on him and walked to the sink to wash her hands. She'd listened. For a long, agonizing minute, there was silence. She thought he might grab her. She thought he might tear the room apart. Instead, she heard him exhale, a shaky, broken sound. Then, the heavy footsteps retreated. The door clicked shut. Nora gripped the edge of the porcelain sink, staring blindly at the running water, taking her first real breath in months. He was gone, but the way he had looked at her, he looked like a man starving to death, and for the first time, she realized she had the power. Dominic did not come back to the archives. He knew better than to push a door that had just been slammed in his face. But men who run criminal empires do not simply give up when told no. They change their tactics. They lay siege. It started quietly. Subtle shifts in her everyday routine that she couldn't explicitly trace back to him, but bore his unmistakable fingerprint. Her landlord, a notorious slumlord who hadn't fixed the heating in 2 years, suddenly replaced her radiators and apologized for the delay. The diner where she ate breakfast every Thursday morning stopped charging her for coffee. When she asked the waitress why, she just nervously wiped the counter and mumbled something about a loyalty program. Nora knew it was him. It was his way of reminding her that he owned the city, and by extension, the perimeter of her life. It pissed her off. 3 weeks after he showed up at the archives, she finally confronted him. It was raining, a cold, miserable November downpour. She was leaving the library, her umbrella struggling against the wind, when she saw him. He was standing across the street, leaning against the hood of a sleek black sedan. He wasn't wearing a $5,000 suit this time. He wore dark jeans, heavy boots, and a simple wool coat. His hair was plastered to his forehead by the rain. He didn't have an umbrella. He was just standing there, getting soaked, watching the entrance. Nora marched across the asphalt, dodging a puddle, and stopped 3 feet in front of him. "You look like a stalker," she said loudly over the traffic. Dominic didn't flinch at the harshness of her tone. He wiped water from his eyes. "I'm learning patience. You're going to catch pneumonia. Go home, Dominic." "I don't want to go home." He took a half step forward. She held her ground. "My home is empty, Nora. It's full of people and it's completely empty. Hire a decorator. I restore paintings, not personalities." A flicker of a smile crossed his wet face. It was a real smile, self-deprecating and exhausted. "I brought you something." He reached into his coat pocket. She braced herself. If he pulled out a velvet jewelry box, if he tried to buy her forgiveness with diamonds or gold, she swore to God she would throw it into the nearest storm drain. Instead, he pulled out a small, heavily padded manila envelope. He held it out. She eyed it suspiciously before taking it. She peeled back the flap. Inside was a small glass vial filled with a brilliant, blindingly vibrant blue powder. Her breath caught. "Genuine Afghan lapis lazuli," Dominic said softly. "Grade A, sourced from the Sare Sang mines. It took my contacts in Dubai 3 weeks to verify it. It's for your 15th century restoration work. I know you hate the synthetic ultramarine." Nora stared at the vial. It was worth more than a car, but its value wasn't financial. It was the fact that he remembered. They had spent exactly 1 evening talking about historical pigments 6 months ago, and he had filed it away. "He isn't trying to buy you," a small voice in her head whispered. "He's trying to show you he knows you." She gripped the envelope tightly, fighting the sudden, treacherous sting of tears behind her eyes. She looked up at him. He was drenched, shivering slightly, looking at her like she held his heart in her hands. "A vial of crushed rock doesn't erase what you said on that balcony," she told him, keeping her voice level. "I know." He didn't offer an excuse. He didn't try to justify his past cruelty. "I was a coward, Nora. I was terrified of looking weak to men I don't even respect. I sacrificed the only real thing in my life for an image that means nothing." "And what happens when your syndicate friends start making jokes?" she challenged, crossing her arms. "What happens when they see the great Dominic Moretti walking into a gala with a woman who wears a size 18? Will you hide me in a corner again? Will you tell them I'm just an employee?" "I will tear out the tongue of any man who disrespects you," he said. The dead, flat voice of the Mafia boss was back, but this time the violence in it was entirely defensive. It was protective. "I don't need a bodyguard, Dominic. I need a man who isn't ashamed of me." "I'm only ashamed of myself," he said. He reached out, his wet hand hovering just an inch from her cheek, not daring to touch her without permission. "Let me prove it to you. One chance, Nora. Let me prove I can stand beside you in the light." She looked at his hovering hand. She looked at the rain soaking his coat. "Strictly professional," she said finally. Her voice shook, just a little. "You need a restorer for the upcoming Russian auction. Your new guy is useless. I'll do it. But we do it on my terms." Dominic exhaled a breath he looked like he'd been holding for a month. His hand dropped, respecting the boundary. "Anything. Pick me up on Friday, 8 p.m. She turned on her heel, gripping her umbrella and the envelope of blue dust. "Don't be late." The Russian syndicate auction was the social equivalent of walking into a tiger enclosure covered in meat. It was held in a private gallery in Manhattan, heavily guarded and packed with the most ruthless, judgmental people on the eastern seaboard. Dominic arrived at her apartment building at exactly 7:59 p.m. When she opened the door, he stopped dead in the hallway. She hadn't worn black. She hadn't worn something safe or something designed to slim her figure. She wore a deep, blood-crimson silk gown. It clung to the heavy curve of her hips, draped luxuriously over her thick thighs, and showcased the soft, full expanse of her chest. Her arms were bare. She wore dark red lipstick and absolutely zero apologies. Dominic didn't speak. He stared at her, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, realizing he desperately wanted to jump. "Well?" Nora asked, grabbing her clutch. "Am I a liability?" "You're going to start a war," he murmured, his voice thick. He offered his arm. "And I am going to let you." The ride to the gallery was silent. The tension inside the car was different this time. It wasn't the heavy, unspoken yearning of the basement, nor the cold rejection of the winter gala. It was the crackling electricity of a storm about to break. When they walked into the gallery, the ambient noise of 100 conversations died down. Heads turned, eyes darted. Nora felt the heat of their stares. She felt the familiar, heavy weight of judgment. The women in their size 0 designer gowns whispered behind champagne flutes. The men looked confused, then amused, then calculating. She instinctively started to pull her arm away from Dominic's, the old armor kicking in, preparing to shrink into the background. Dominic clamped his hand over hers, locking her arm against his side. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight ahead, his jaw set, his posture radiating absolute, lethal authority. "Head up," he whispered in her ear, his breath warm against her neck. "You are the queen of this room." Let them look. They navigated the floor. Nora appraised 3 paintings for him, quietly verifying their authenticity while he stood at her shoulder. He didn't leave her side for a single second. He introduced her to underbosses, to legitimate politicians, and to foreign smugglers. "This is Nora," he said every time, his voice ringing loud and clear. "The finest eye in the city, and the woman I am with." He didn't hide her. He presented her. Then Grigory Volkov approached. Grigory was the head of the Bratva, a massive, scarred man who viewed diplomacy as a weakness. He swaggered over, flanked by two heavily armed guards, a smirk playing on his lips. "Moretti!" Grigory boomed, his accent thick. He gripped Dominic's hand in a crushing shake. Then his cold, pale eyes slid to Nora. He looked her up and down, slowly, deliberately, lingering on her hips and stomach with open disdain. "I see you brought substantial company tonight," Grigory said. He let out a barking laugh, looking back at Dominic. "I heard Clara left you. I didn't realize your tastes had shifted from thoroughbreds to draft horses." The silence that fell over their section of the room was absolute. The air turned to ice. Nora's stomach plummeted. This was it. The exact scenario Dominic had feared. The public mockery. The loss of face. She looked at Dominic, expecting him to laugh it off, expecting the smooth, diplomatic deflection that would save his pride at the expense of her dignity. Dominic didn't smile. He didn't deflect. He calmly reached out, picked up a crystal champagne flute from a passing waiter's tray, and without breaking eye contact with Grigory, he casually poured the drink onto the floor between Grigory's expensive leather shoes. Grigory's guards tensed, hands dropping to their holsters. Dominic's own men stepped out of the shadows, guns half drawn. The gallery was 3 seconds away from a bloodbath. "You misunderstand the dynamic, Grigory," Dominic said. His voice was no louder than a conversational murmur, but it carried the chilling, terrifying promise of a graveyard. "She isn't company. She is the only thing in this room I actually value." Grigory's face turned purple. "You insult me over a—" "Finish that sentence, and you will not leave this gallery breathing," Dominic interrupted. He stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Nora, shielding her, claiming her. "You will apologize to her. Now, or the port deal is dead, the alliance is over, and we go to the mattresses tonight." Nora stared at his broad back. He was throwing away a multi-million-dollar syndicate alliance. He was risking a mob war. For her, for the fat girl from the basement. Grigory looked at Dominic's eyes, searching for a bluff. He found nothing but absolute, homicidal sincerity. The Russian swallowed hard. He looked at Nora, his pride warring with his wallet. The wallet won. "My apologies, miss," Grigory ground out, his jaw tight. A poor joke. He turned and stormed away, his guards rushing after him. The tension in the room slowly bled out. The conversations hesitantly resumed. Dominic turned back to Nora. The lethal coldness in his eyes melted away the second he looked at her face. He looked physically drained, but his shoulders were relaxed. The ghost of his fear of public perception was gone, exorcised by the fire of his own actions. "You almost started a war," she whispered. "Let it burn," he replied, his voice soft, rough with emotion. He reached out, and this time he didn't stop. He cupped her face in his large, warm hands. His thumbs gently stroked her cheekbones. "I meant it, Nora. Everything else is just noise. The money, the power, the image, it's all dust. You are the masterpiece." He looked down at her lips, and then back up to her eyes, waiting for permission. She didn't step back. The armor she had worn her entire life felt suddenly heavy, unnecessary. She let it drop. She reached up and gripped his wrists. If you kiss me right now, Dominic, there is no going back. I am not a secret. I am not a phase. You are my future, he vowed. He leaned down, and she met him halfway. The kiss was not soft. It was desperate, bruising, and deeply grounding. It tasted like champagne, cedar, and undeniable reality. She felt the solid weight of him against her, and for the first time in her life, she didn't worry about how much space she was taking up. She took up exactly enough. She took up his whole world. Did Nora's unapologetic revenge and Dominic's ultimate redemption hit you right in the feels? We love a hero who realizes his terrible mistake and burns his own empire to the ground just to prove his loyalty. If you want more intense, grounded mafia romances where the women take no prisoners and demand exactly what they're worth, smash that like button. Share this story with your fellow romance lovers. And don't forget to subscribe for more epic audio dramas.